I mean, nobody now claims that they're not green. Nobody. That includes, the
City of London.
The City of London. It includes the far right. Even they care for small, cuddly animals and so on. The question is, what is really required here? And of course, what it really required is a complete change of system. And we're a long way from that.
You're going to get your revolution, do you think? Are you ever going to get it?
Well, it depends what you mean by revolution, doesn't it, Tony? We could get a social breakdown with a lot of people killed. So that might be called a revolution. Because of the bloodshed. But the word revolution is much abused. It's like the word fascist. Well, what does it mean?
Well, I would say a real revolution. I mean, very often they're hijacked. In fact, 9 times out of 10, the people who are being revolutioned against are quite ready and prepared with their new system and infiltrate the revolutionaries so that they get there to control the outcome. Order ab chaos, some people call it, order from chaos, which is the motto of the Scottish Rite of Freemasons and Albert Pike and his crew. But there's also this whole idea of turning the world upside down, isn't there, Martin?
Well, the word revolution originally meant, in the Middle Ages and going back into the classical era, just a change of leadership. And the idea was that revolutions happen fairly automatically.
What about Marx? What did he mean?
Dynasties fell and other people took over. Well, Marx took his concept of revolution from the French Revolution.
Oh, nasty!
Yeah, but the idea is that Mao Zedong, of course, took it from the same stable. Mao Zedong said that revolution is an act of violence by which one class overthrows another.
Well, okay, the French Revolution, some would point out, including Dennis Wheatley, what does he know, that this was the revenge of the Knights Templars on the French monarchy.
Well, there are all sorts of things going on in the French Revolution, and the more...
Not a single person who was descended from Philip the Fair survived the French Revolution, apparently.
Well, that may be so, Tony, but in actual fact, most modern historians don't look at it in those terms, as you can imagine.
No. Most modern historians don't look at 9/11 in the terms we do.
Well, no, but I mean, you can't just bundle 9/11 in with the theory of revolution from the 19th century.
No, I'm not. I wasn't doing that. I was contrasting. We've got massive areas of academia who I would suggest are simply bought and paid for stables of influence.
What you've actually got is there's a huge historical argument about what the French Revolution was.
Anyway, we had a very
British
version of revolution, and that is, I think, this whole idea of the world turned upside down. In fact, you might not believe this, but I actually last weekend, I bought a world turned upside down tea towel. I couldn't quite believe it, in the old Cromwell Museum, because I was over there last week. We had a lot of fun, actually. Maybe I should do that. If any listeners have got ideas of where they want us to have this show live from on a Friday, because we've now just about perfected the idea, well, I shouldn't say that, it's tempting fate, of doing these live broadcasts. So if you've got an idea of where we should be live one Friday, do let me know. At least give me a few weeks' notice, and I'll see what I can to do that and do the show from there, since we're able to do that now. But last weekend I was over at the Common Rights Holders, the Chakra, the Scolthead and District Common Right Holders Association's annual general meeting in North Norfolk. And whilst I was over there, I dropped in to see some people that I've only ever really chatted to on the phone before, Paul Crofts and Richard Jacks from the independent socialists in Wellingborough, who were actually fascinating and really into their history, as I am. And the reason for Wellingborough, Martin, is that this is one of the places where the Diggers were in the English Civil War.
Well, that may be so, but what do they have to say?
The Diggers in the English Civil War?
Well, no, these guys...
Well, we'll be hearing from them in a minute, but what's the significance of these Diggers to you as a socialist?
Well, we had the discussion about this when you went up to Wigan to the Diggers. The Diggers have been more influential in modern times on the left wing in Britain. In the previous eras, the Levellers were more influential because they were more mainstream.
Yeah,
and
there were more of them.
There were more of them, that's right.
They were soldiers.
Yeah. And that's right. And, of course, ultimately, if you talk about the world turned upside down, the English Revolution, if you like, failed for the majority of the people. So, in actual fact,
it wasn't a revolution, was it? It was a civil war. That's why it's called the Civil War.
Well, I mean, yes.
There were some people like John Rees who likes to think about it as a level of revolution. He's the guy from the so-called Stop the War group in London who refused to be interviewed about his book because he knew I was going to ask him some awkward questions about his book. I think it's called The Leveller Revolution. And, of course, it wasn't a revolution at all.
Well, it was an attempted revolution.
And it was hijacked right from the start. But anyway, let's have a listen now to the indie socialists in Wellingborough. That is Paul Crofts and Richard Jacks, because I went out with them in the evening, last Saturday evening, when we were over there. I think it was Saturday. And they took me to the memorial, which had been actually constructed to the Wellingborough Diggers from the English Civil War. And they explained who the Diggers were and why they're still relevant today.
My name's Paul Crofts, and I'm a member of Independent Socialists in Wellingborough, a small socialist group which continues to keep the flames of socialism alive. And we're here in Prologis Park, which is a new distribution warehouse centre.
Okay, you say new. How long has it been here?
This has been here about 5 years, Richard.
About
five years or so this was built. So it's pretty new. And that link line is very new. That wasn't here the last time I was here. So this is an area that's growing as a distribution area with warehouses. And in the heart of it is a small plaque to the Wellingborough Diggers. And most people are unaware of the Wellingborough Diggers, but this area of land in the 17th century was, of course, all farmland. Or, no, it wasn't farmland, it was common land.
Well, I'd say probably even 10 years ago it might have been farmland, mightn't it?
Well, it's still farmland, yeah, until 10 years ago it was farmland. But in 1649, when the diggers were around, it was common land. It belonged to the people and was used by everybody for their cattle, to grow crops, and it didn't belong to anybody. It was subsequently enclosed and became owned by somebody. But prior to that, it was common land. And in 1649 there was terrible famine in Wellingborough. The people were starving and things were very, very bad, and a group of local residents who were inspired by the writings of Gerard Winstanley decided to occupy the common land and to sow seed and to try and grow crops to feed their families. And they issued a declaration, which is, the original is now in the British Museum, but we have facsimiles which are available, which
there's a copy right here in the business park, actually, right, which is rather nice, isn't it? It's all printed as if it was just straight out of the English Civil War, actually. The same typefaces. Even at the bottom of it, it says London, printed for Giles Calvert, 1649.
Yes, and that's a facsimile of the original Wellingborough Digger Declaration, which is in the British Museum. And Prologis, the company that developed the distribution centre, agreed that there should be a plaque to the Wellingborough Diggers following it being suggested to them by local people who wanted some memorial to the Wellingborough Diggers.
Now, you've got your colleague here as well. Could you just introduce yourself briefly and say, who were the Diggers? Why did they decide to do that at that time? Because this is straight after the Civil War, which must have been quite traumatic.
I think I'm Richard Jackson. I'm also a member of the ISW. I think it was a traumatic period in the history, and I think the movements were very embryonic. And I think in this part of the country they were divided too, and there were different things going in different parts, and it was coinciding with the Civil War. And there was a desire to try and establish something independent, and in a curious way there was a lot of free thinking. And Gerald Winstanley's inspiration sort of carried forth into the neighbourhood. It's a shame, actually, that this hasn't carried forward to this day. But there were people, and there were movements, and there were movements of autonomous groupings.
No, it's actually got a pretty good timeline here as well. Look, taking us right from 1609, well before the Civil War even started.
That's right, absolutely, and it takes us all the way along, right the way through to our own kind of more recent 2011, the first Diggers Festival we had locally, which was inspired by a succession of different left-wing people coming together in Wellingborough. And we've held this event probably for the last 6 or 7 years. It got a little bit quiet last year. It involved music, poetry, it involved lectures at the local Quaker house, and people making speeches. And we had Alan Moore, who's a famous author based in Northampton, giving an incredible speech about the importance of the radical history of Northamptonshire in 2016, I think it was, who wrote a history of Northamptonshire called Jerusalem, which is really interesting. He gave a lovely talk about the importance of the radical movements of the county. A lot of this is fed into the more kind of recent activities which Paul and others have led in defiance of the council cuts that have happened in the division of this county into 2 bits as well. So
I'm wondering, why is this still, if it is, still relevant today? Because we've got, this amazing business park, nothing like what this all... I mean, this seems to be thriving, but it's not... You don't see people here. It's just trucks. In fact, you hardly get anyone to speak to, would you?
No, you have very few people to speak to. I think basically this place is is almost a metaphor for basically what we've come to in this country half the time. That the county, which is prided on being next to the Rhondda Valley, the most intensively run industry part of the country, which is boots and shoes, is reduced to being basically something to do with its location, which is warehousing and nothing else. No skills, poor, people who are completely divided in terms of any union recognition.
There's a tremendous amount of history, even in the town centre in Wellingborough.
There is a huge amount of history in the town centre, and I think there is this massive absence of a sense of local affinity. You know, there is an association sometimes between the idea of civic pride being a right-wing thing. Well, it isn't necessarily, because I think people should feel an affinity to their towns. And I showed you slightly earlier 2 kind of redundant buildings, which is probably the best examples of Tudor architecture anywhere, which by right should be taken over and used for public benefit.
Amazing. What's your thoughts on the relevance of what we see in front of us here today?
Well, Winstanley and writing in the 17th century was concerned about land ownership. He was concerned about the enclosure movement and the taking over of land by the aristocracy and the growing middle classes buying land. And
just to explain, because the enclosure, what happened was people. These were private acts of Parliament, but let's not forget this is well before the Reform Act. So only people with large amounts of land could even vote in those days. So they were voting themselves private ownership of the land.
Absolutely. And the common people, up until that point, there was at least some common land that belonged to the people. And once they were dispossessed of that, they had nothing except ultimately their labour power, which of course in subsequent centuries, the 18th and 19th century, formed the modern working class moving into towns and cities, because they were dispossessed from the land. But in the 17th century, people were still essentially tied to the land. But the diggers, the digger movement was inspired by Winstanley, who said that the land belongs to them. It wasn't given to the wealthy. The wealthy had stolen it from the common people, and in fact he went even further and said that these Normans who came in 1066 dispossessed the Saxons. He often talked at that time, the digger movement and others often talked about the Norman yoke still being relevant to the oppression of the peasantry and the people of England, and of course perhaps other parts of the United Kingdom as well, but at that time, of course, it wasn't so much a United Kingdom.
Okay, so how do people follow what you guys are doing here in Wellingborough?
Well, I think there is obviously there's not as much activity as there used to be, but if they wanted to find out, ISW puts itself out on Facebook pages. We often have demonstrations we often have activities in town around particularly core issues around deprivation, around, in terms of Paul and I, it's international moves like Palestine Solidarity, but other things which are to do with what's going on with cuts and fighting the cuts in town and getting involved, I think, in general left-wing activities, which is particularly pertinent to this town, as we've got probably Britain's worst MP at the moment, and called Peter Bone, who is absolutely atrocious. He used to employ people on 89 pence an hour and this sort of thing, who's, for his voting record, I'm supporting everything right-wing that moves. moves. So
we understand that the Taliban have just appointed him as their representative in the United Kingdom because their policies are so closely aligned.
Okay, guys, it's atrocious. So yes, I mean there is a lot of work still to be done. It's a case of classic Lenin: 2 steps forward, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back.
I'll ask you both an awkward question because socialism seems to be out the window with Keir Starmer taking over the Labour Party. The last hope really was surely Corbyn, and he's long gone.
Well, you can't snuff out a flame that dates back well before even the 17th century. You had John Ball and the ideas of socialism, common ownership, people looking after each other, caring for each other, not being driven by the profit motive, by private ownership, but by a morality and an ethics which says we should care and cooperate and work together. That can't be killed off by Keir Starmer. That will survive, and it will survive Jeremy Corbyn as it has done over the centuries. And the words of Winstanley are essentially socialist words from they're crouched in biblical language, but essentially the Bible, the quotes from the Bible are about humanity and about how humanity survives, and that will continue in fact, it will definitely continue beyond Keir Starmer.
What are your thoughts about the death of socialism?
Well, I think you're asking a person who's 64, and you just asked somebody who's even older than me. Quite frankly, ask young people, because they're our future, and that is the main problem we've got, is actually politicisation, or sometimes a depoliticisation of young people. And it's critical that an environmental agenda is embraced and understood with the context of what Jim Stanley was saying as well. Okay, and I think a lot of young people could be kind of brought into the whole equation. And XR is a good example of where, politics is becoming truly alternative, and less of the constraints around party politics and the ridiculous sort of polarities that exist.
Okay, well, from Wellingborough, from the Diggers Memorial, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And,
so that's Paul Crofts and Richard Jacks. From Wellingborough last weekend. Martin, it's I think fascinating looking at this, the long view of socialism. They're saying that actually these ideas will live forever, and actually Keir Starmer can't stop them.
Well, I broadly agree with that. And don't forget that you've still got the Chinese economy, which is based on, they claim to be a socialist economy.
Not Christians, though, are they?
No, they're not. No, they're not, Tony.
So what is going on with Marx?
Do you have to be a Christian to be a socialist?
What is going on with Marx? Is he basically taking... Because, there is this famous quote, isn't there, in the Book of Acts about having all things in common, as the disciples did. Jesus and his followers had all things in common. But Marx seems to have decided that that's okay, but you're not allowed to talk about Jesus at all.
Well, you've got to distinguish between Marxist socialists and Christian socialists. Christian socialism has a long and honourable history.
Well, funny enough,
some Marxists are. The Latin American leadership, like people like Chavez and so on, were Christians, Catholic Christians, but also they would say that they were Marxists.
It seems to me if you take the anti-Christian side of it out, Marx is much, much better. Also, you were talking about the Christian socialists. One of the most famous was Charles Kingsley. And it's funny because just down the road from Wellingborough is Ely, which is where one of the most famous books by Charles Kingsley was all about Hereward the Wake, and he discussed the sort of what the Normans were imposing in the Norman invasion, and how Hereward resisted the Norman invasion very successfully in Ely. And so, all that part of the country. It's fascinating. Also, amazing to hear radical Northamptonshire, the whole history of how Northamptonshire played a major part, because, of course, that part of the world, I didn't realise until I drove around there, is a massive amount of agriculture going on, particularly in Norfolk, but even west of that too. But anyway, so ultimately with the diggers and the land, we have a kind of link up with what's going on today. Because Bill Gates is doing everything he possibly can to buy up. In fact, he's promised to buy up most of the Western world's farmland, and he's doing it already. He's using his massive wealth to buy farmland up.
Well, the struggle for access to land as a key resource is a major issue in developing countries. And of course, one of the things that happened in China, when the Communist Party took over, is they redistributed the land. So millions of people got access to land who'd never had it before, and people who used to dominate it were frankly eliminated. It was a bloody revolution. lots of people died.
And they redistributed the Christians too, although there were that many around. Anyway, thank you to Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers there, and to our friends in Independent Socialists in Wellingborough. My book on the Fourth Reich, containing 30 years of research into the origins of the Bilderbergers, in the deals done between the Nazis and the Allies and the links back to World War II Battle of Arnhem, portrayed in the film A Bridge Too Far, is out in paperback. You can get it from Amazon. Not from Amazon. Yes, you can, I think. Oh, gosh. Anyway, you can certainly get it from eBay quite easily if you're in the UK, and it can be sent abroad too. Price £15, including postage. That will just take you through the whole of the endgame of the Second World War, including all the nuclear stuff as well. And my anthology on secret government from Cromwell to the assassination of Princess Diana, called The Siege of Heaven Reader. You can get them on eBay, and the Siege of Heaven ebook, and links to all of them via www.bilderberg.org. And there's been some problems with that site. Just see if you can use a different browser or click through. Some browsers are stopping people looking at that site. Anyway, join us in a minute as we take our weekly look at the real big investigations of the week, which is the crooked police in South Wales and the Metropolitan Police too.